Hey YouTube, welcome to the first ever episode of ESG This Week. I'm your host, Tim Nash. I'm trying out a new format where I go through my top 3 stories from the world of sustainable finance. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether I should keep doing this, and please share any stories that I missed. Let's jump in. So the first story I've got for you today is about Canadian banks and fossil fuel financing. Basically, a report came out looking at the global banks' financing of fossil fuels. This has gotten major coverage around the world. This is from Al Jazeera. And, surprise, surprise, our good friends at the Royal Bank of Canada were the largest financier of fossil fuels in 2022. Investing more than $42 billion in fossil fuels, which is just ridiculous in this day and age. So I wanted to show you the report, Banking on Climate Chaos. They've been doing these reports for a while. This just came out this week, brand new figures in this report. Really the big details that I love is this chart. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little closer here. Basically, it's got the top banks and how much they've invested in fossil fuels over the last 7 years. So JP Morgan Chase, right? Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. Here's RBC. Down here, Scotiabank, TD. The Canadian companies are all kind of at the top. Bank of Montreal and CIBC, our sort of big five, are all, front and center on this list. You can see it for each year. I'll kind of come over here because we're more interested in the 2022 figures. These are the brand new ones. We can look at the totals, right? So the largest ones here, but really it is the winner for 2022. Sort of, I think we're all the losers, but the winner for 2022 is RBC. At the $42 billion mark. So it's just absurd, any of these banks that are promoting themselves as leaders in sustainability and promoting the transition, it's just ridiculous that they continue to fund fossil fuels to the tunes of, billions. In this case, if we look over the last 7 years, the cumulative figure is over $5.4 trillion. Financing fossil fuels. So, this is, banks can talk about ESG scores and leader in sustainability. If you're still financing fossil fuels, I think this is going to be the most material issue, that it's just going to be really hard to take any of the Canadian banks seriously on climate issues, provided they're still doing this. Right. And, it's just interesting when we look at the figures, kind of what's going on, that the Canadian banks absolutely just sort of punch above their weight. We're right up there with China in terms of financing fossil fuels. Remember, the US is like 10 times larger than Canada. So on a proportional basis, we should be about 1/10 of the US. And, we're so much more than that. It just really is sad how much of a laggard we are on these issues. If you're curious, just in the last sort of, year, what's been going on, this is the amount increase from 2021 into 2022. And you can see TD, they've taken some decent steps on climate change stuff, but sadly, when I follow the money, they invested an additional $7 billion in fossil fuels last year compared to the previous year. It's just unconscionable what these banks are doing. And, you can talk as much as you want about climate leadership, but if you're still financing billions of dollars into fossil fuels, it's just going to ring a little bit hollow for me. Speaking of RBC, story number 2 is about their AGM, their annual general meeting that took place last week. Forgive me, it was a little more than a week ago. It wasn't exactly this week, but I think it's still worth talking about because something really remarkable happened there. So it's kind of a weird story. Basically, every year these companies have their AGM, their annual general meeting. Now, RBC has been under fire for the last several years, in part because of their financing of fossil fuels that we just saw, but also in terms of some of the specific projects, the Coastal GasLink CGL pipeline, which is being built, going through Indigenous territory. So leaders from different Indigenous groups showed up at the AGM. Now, they actually went to the AGM last year. It was supposed to be in Toronto. Normally it's in Toronto. Activists showed up and basically RBC shut it down. They said, no, we're going all virtual. They canceled the in-person event like the day before. And really, I think the activists kind of got to them. They were really worried that this was going to turn into a big scene. So this year they held their AGM in Saskatoon. They decided to move it to Saskatchewan. But of course, people still showed up. Activists showed up. People wanted to get in the room and share their stories. And it's just the saddest thing. Basically, a number of different activists and climate leaders were not allowed in the room. I follow this guy, Bo O'Sullivan, who was at the AGM, says, I've been following bank AGMs for 7 years. RBC's response today is by far and away the most unprofessional, disproportionate, and disrespectful I've ever seen. Read on for more about what happened, including suspected snipers and a shareholder rebellion. So, some nice photos of the protesters outside the AGM. In terms of inside, it was just really sad. Like this is a grandmother, this is an elder who's like trying to get in the room, and these two security guards are just like, nope, you're not allowed to pass. Nope, can't go through. They said the room was full, but I don't know. It really seems like BS to me. That these people, they're allowed to be there. So again, shareholders have the right to show up and speak at the AGM. This is part of the process for publicly traded companies. And so, shareholders gave their proxies to this woman and other activists to be able to speak their voice, and they were denied entry. There's a woman, Roychetta from Louisiana, implored the board chair, mother to mother, to consider the impacts of its financing of dirty methane gas in her community, which is impacting her kids' health and future, right? And she wasn't allowed in. Like, this is her trying to get into the room, and these security guards are just like, nope, not allowed in. They were sent into a secondary room, which again is just ridiculous. Like, this is just... They were shifted to a different room within the hotel where, there were some activists here where they were able to at least, speak their voice. Police refer to snipers on the roof. So these would have been the protesters outside who took these photos of just sort of these kind of like hooded figures. Don't see any guns. Don't know for sure if they were snipers, but man, that's sketchy. And, if the police that are there monitoring, like, joked about it or made reference to it, I mean, that's just so threatening, so unnecessary. In the end, there were proposals put forward at the AGM. Unfortunately, they did fail. They didn't get 50% of the votes required, but they did end up with about 25% support for a proposal asking RBC to get free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous people for projects that it finances. So that is huge. 25% is massive. No question that these protesters have had an impact, really are pushing forward really, really important issues. They're getting their voice heard. It's just so sad that, like, they're literally segregated in a different room, that, there's so much intimidation involved in this process. Like, really, RBC, you're making this much money, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the fire. If you're curious what it looked like on the inside, this is sort of a photo. This is a guy who sort of works for RBC. He's got senior vice president, here in Saskatoon is a city of bridges. Thank you for hosting our AGM and sending us home inspired by what an inclusive, climate smart world can look like. To get there, we'll need a lot of bridge builders. So let's get going. So, this to me just is sort of greenwashing, front and center. RBC is going to talk a big game about climate leadership, but we know, like, we have the data, and through their actions, they are telling us who they are. Coverage in Canadian media, obviously is a little bit more centered on the bank rather than the activists. Here in the Globe and Mail, RBC boss defends financing strategy related to climate change. So, I'm certainly happy they're covering these things and telling the story here. But, like, obviously this is about the defense of it. It's not going to happen overnight. We need a timely transition. Personally, I think the time for a timely transition is over. If we wanted to start 10 years ago, sure, but based on where we are right now, I think these banks have a lot of carbon risk associated with them. Reputationally, you can see it right here. My last story is a good news story. This is a win. So I wanted to end on a positive note. So it's close to my hometown here in Toronto. Victoria University agrees to divest from fossil fuel companies by 2030. It's an incredible story because basically there was an 18-day student occupation that they took over the building, which is just amazing. It's like, to me, the coolest thing. I love student activism in this way. Basically the story goes that a couple years ago, U of T announced that they would divest from fossil fuels by 2030. The university's decision did not include U of T's 3 federated colleges, Victoria University, Trinity College, and the University of St. Michael's College. So these are independent endowments. So U of T promised they would divest, and the students are like, okay, Victoria University, like, come on now. Like, let's get going on this. I want to be clear, this isn't selling fossil fuels right away. This is by 2030. So again, lots of time for an orderly transition. One of my favorite, protests or chants at a protest, a climate change protest, is sort of, what do we want? Fossil fuel divestment. What do we want? Gradually over the next 7 years. This really is quite reasonable, understanding the transition that's taking place right now. So just wanted to bring some attention to what they did. Basically, the 22 U of T students slept in the building overnight. So this was sort of day 2. You can see they set up their tents. Over time, this was on the weekend, this is on a Saturday. They had some clubs and they had some groups and lots of people in there. This is after 14 days, so 2 weeks in, right? Students sort of still going strong. They got some great coverage. National Observer did cover what they're doing, which I think is really important to add pressure. And then last night, we got the word that they have approved motions to divest from fossil fuels in its endowment portfolio, which is great. Now, exposure to direct fossil fuel producers. So they're going to divest from the fossil fuel companies, but not from RBC or the financiers. This is a big thing in divestment circles. But either way, this is like a huge win for the students. And I just want to give them the biggest possible shout out for this awesome win. So that's it. Those are my stories. ESG this week. Hope you enjoyed it. If you want more of this, like, subscribe. If I missed any stories, please add them in the comments. I would love to hear what you think. Thanks so much for watching.